Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Donna Lee and Susan Wilhelm both became certified Arlington Alexandria Master Gardeners in 2017. This is actually their fourth year teaching the principles of vegetable gardening in our urban agriculture series, and they've done it both in person and virtually. Both love vegetable gardening, especially growing different varieties, trying new techniques, and of course, getting to eat what they've grown. They'll share many of their own experiences and lessons learned. Donna and Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Colleen, thank you. Thank you, Julie, for in advance for facilitating the Q&A that comes in via the chat. Well, welcome to everyone. It was interesting to see where folks are coming from. We've learned as we've been doing these virtual online classes that people are able to join us that we were never able to have join us before. When we started out, we would get 20 to 30 people in an in-person class, and we were happy about that. And now we get sometimes 100 or more. This class is focused on folks starting out in vegetable gardening, but if you are already gardening, I think you'll learn still a lot from it, and you'll be able to take advantage of a lot of the resources that we're going to provide to you as we go throughout the presentation. Everyone who registered in advance should have received a couple of files via email, possibly yesterday or Wednesday. And that would be a copy, a handout, a PDF of the slides that we're going to show you today and next Friday, and as well as a planting schedule that we're going to get into that is for our area. And it looks like this. You've got a handout with this, another PDF, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. It's for our area, but there's still a lot on it that you can use and adapt for your own area. And then there's a web references. So as we go through, let's see if you can see it. My camera's over here. Okay. As you go through, there's lots of references that we provide. And rather than you worry about losing the reference, we put them all onto 2 sheets. And that way, after the presentation, you can go to any one of those references and look at it to get more information. So we're gonna go over these 9 steps between today and next Friday. Today, we're going to cover just the top 4, and it's going to take us the whole hour and a half with Q&A to do that. There's a lot that we're going to cover. So we may start to speed it up and talk fast if it looks like we're running out of time. And then next Friday, we're going to talk about steps 5 through 9. And this way we get to cover everything that you need to know. So we're going to cover here quick facts from Northern Virginia. At the end of today's brief, we're going to give you some links that you can go and look up some of the same information for your area if you're not aware of it, if you're just starting out. So for Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia, which are right outside Washington, D.C., we're in zone 7A or 7B in the U.S. Department of Agriculture plant hardiness map. And then what that tells us from that map is that the average last killing frost in the spring, last time we're going to get temperatures on hard temperatures under 32, are the beginning of April 1 through the 10th. And then the average first killing frost in the fall, when our tender vegetables like the peppers and the squash and the tomatoes will be damaged or killed, is the beginning of November 1 through 10. Now that's the average. So that means that a couple years ago, when we got a last killing frost in May, after it looked like it had already warmed up, that happens because it's just an average, and it can end a little bit sooner. You can have one late like that, and same thing with the first killing. So you have to keep that in mind, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The great thing for us here in Northern Virginia is that we have a really long growing season. So that's 6 months, right? So that is really fantastic. That allows us to pretty much grow anything that we might want to grow in our area in terms of the length of time from planting to maturity. One thing that we do have though in this area is a lot more hotter summer days. So this whole idea of climate change is impacting us in the sense that we're having more days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, more nights over 70 degrees, and that impacts some of the things like peppers and tomatoes that many of us love to grow because those plants will slow down and not flower as well and not ripen as well when it gets that hot during the day and at night. And so things will slow down, and you'll say, why do I have so many green tomatoes? Well, it's just the heat. And once the heat starts to drop back down, they'll pick up and they'll finish ripening, and you'll get more flowers and more fruit. The other thing in this area is rainfall. The average over 40 years for this area is 40 inches of rain a year. So that's the full year, the 12 months. In 2018, we broke a record that had been standing for years, and we had rainfall of 64.4 inches. In 2020, again, we got 57 inches of rain. And when we get to the section on watering, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact in terms of our gardens and what we need to do to keep things going well. So clay soils dominate in this area. And what that means for us is sometimes we get standing water. We have really tough soil, hard for roots to get through. And we're going to spend time as we go through this next section talking about how to evaluate our soil. What we talk about here, you can do this anywhere. It's not just for Virginia. So first thing let's look at is step one, pick your location. So you have a lot of site options. You can grow things in the ground. If you look at this traditional garden plot right here in the middle, that's my plot. That's in a garden. I'm planting stuff in the ground. That's right after I planted some stuff in the early spring, and I'm using straw to keep the weeds down. If you go clockwise from there, you can see here's a container. It looks like a raised bed, and we have lettuces, we have some flowers, we have kale. That's lovely. Up here, we have some boxes, some containers. That's one way to do it. We have window boxes on a balcony. Here we have additional window boxes where we have some ornamental stuff, and then we put in some edibles. And then down here we have a landscape bed where so I'm in the bottom right photo, where we have some edibles, and then we have some flowers and some other things. And so I want you to start to think about different ways, different places that you might be able to garden, and don't feel like if I don't have a big backyard, I can't have a garden. My garden in the middle is actually at a community garden because I live in a townhouse. So let's look at site selection. One of the biggest things, maybe it's not really the biggest, but one of the most things that will keep you gardening and make it easy is to have a convenient location. If your garden is 30 minutes away from where you live, it's a little difficult to just pop in and do a little weeding and do a little harvesting. That's the only place that you have, go for it. But I'm just letting you know that as the season goes on, you'll want to be there often, because sometimes if you look at a vegetable today and say, that zucchini is a little small, I'm going to pick it tomorrow and don't get back for 3 or 4 days. Next thing you know, it's as big as your arm. Seriously, that happens. Or okra, you look at an okra and it's only an inch or two big, and then you go back in a couple of days and it is now 7 inches and you can't cut it with a steak knife. So it's nice to be able to get to your garden and kind of keep an eye on things. You need to have water supply. You can't lug water to your garden if it's miles away. If it's a matter of filling containers and then taking it out to like a driveway or out to a balcony, that works out okay. But you're going to need to think about where you're going to get your water from. Airflow is an interesting thing. You need airflow to keep things healthy so that leaves get dried off and so that you don't have some of the fungus diseases. But if your plants are in a place where they have no protection, sometimes that airflow can really damage them. In the wintertime, when we get those strong winds, or in the early spring, sometimes that can damage your plants and they can look a little ragged. So it's nice if there's some wind protection, but again, it's that sort of balance. When I grow seeds inside, I use a fan because I want to keep some air blowing on them, one, to keep them healthy from diseases, and also that airflow helps build the strength of the stems of some of the plants so that they do better. So kind of interesting thing. We want to have sunlight. We're going to talk about how much sunlight in the following slide. We need to think about the proximity to trees and shrubs. Some trees like walnut actually have a chemical such that if you try to plant near them, they won't thrive. Other problems though with trees and shrubs are just the roots that are taking the water that the vegetables or flowers might need. So you want to think about that. And we'll also talk a little bit about shade and how shade from tall trees and shrubs can impact the amount of sun that you get in your garden, that your plants can benefit from. We're going to talk in depth about soil condition and water drainage in some of these next slides. So first, let's talk about sunlight for your vegetables. Fruiting vegetables, so those are things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, squash, cucumbers. They need full sun. So the lowest level for full sun is considered 6 to 8 hours, but 12 hours is great, and that's what they'll get in the peak of the summer. And you can't really get too much sun. You can get too much heat, but you really can't get too much sun for vegetables that like sun. root vegetables need at least 5 to 6 hours. That's the radishes and the carrots. That doesn't mean that they won't take the full sun. That's perfectly fine, but they can produce and do okay or do well with just 5 to 6 hours. Now greens, so the greens could be the lettuces, the spinach, Swiss chard. They like partial sun. They can take partial sun. Again, in the early spring when the sun isn't so high in the sky and isn't so hot, they can take the 6 or 8 hours of sun. As we start to get into the heat of the summer, those vegetables will sort of die off. They'll go to flower and they'll be done. But they can grow in 4 to 5 hours of sun. So that's good to know as we start to look at places where you might have available to plant. There's many herbs that can actually do well in partial sun as well. So shade is considered less than 4 hours of direct sun a day. That's like fully shaded. So what we want to start to talk about and think about is picking the right plant for the right place. If you plant tomatoes in an area that gets partial sun, you may get some tomatoes, but you may be a little bit unhappy with the production. And it's not because it's a bad spot, it's just a bad spot for that plant. So here's a quick little exercise that you could do. It's called sun mapping. And what you do is you can go through this exercise and you'll be able to know at the end what kind of sun you get in your garden. So what you'll do is you'll make a sketch or a map of your property, sort of the macro view, or just maybe your garden plot itself, the micro view. And what you want to do is make the sketch and then make 5 copies of it. And then on a nice sunny day, you want to go out and taking these copies of the map, you want to record where the sun and the shade falls every 3 hours. So you start at 9 in the morning and you finish up at 6. Then you make a final sun map by looking at the same spot on each of these 4 maps, and you're going to make a composite. So let's look at an example. So here's my example. This is my townhouse, just because it was easy. So this is sort of a little bit of a macro, this mini macro view. So my townhouse, the front of it is at the bottom in this upper left map. So here's the door going in through the front. Here's going out the back. So because it faces south in the morning, I get some sun coming across this way, and then it goes down to the side. So what happens is I don't get any sun here at 9 o'clock in the front at all. I get a little bit of sun back here. But why do I get just that little corner? Well, because I have a fence around my property. Now, I didn't show that on the map, but you could show fences. I have a tree in the corner here, and I don't show that. It's a magnolia that's 20 years old, so it shades a lot there. So the back, I don't really see anything. So then I'm going to move on. So at noon, it's all shaded in the back. In the front, I have sun here, so I have X's in the blocks. Each block is foot. 2 foot, I guess. And then down here I have sun. Then I go to 3 o'clock, it's still sunny, still shady in the back. At 6 o'clock, still shady in the back. And now look over here, and I'm going in the front door. So the flower bed to the left, all of a sudden it's shaded. Well, what you don't see is behind that is a sidewalk. So in front is a sidewalk, and behind that is a big tall tree. And so as the sun is coming over the horizon and setting, the townhouse is behind me or across from me, that tree is shading that bed, and it's getting less sun. But I got sun at noon and at 3, so not too bad. So then you go down here to my final sun map. And so what I can figure out is this bed, I had to turn sideways, but this is the bed on the left as I go in the front door. And I'm going to call that now partly sunny. And then I have the bed on the other side of the front door, and that one's clearly sunny. It's getting sun for 3 of those times. In the back, I'm going to have to just call it shady, because really I only had that one spot that got a little bit of sun, and that was it. So if you look here in the bottom right, that's actually the bed to the left of my front door. And it turns out that I was able to grow some small Thai pepper plants in that. So it's an idea of edible landscaping. I had 5 plants, and over the summer on one day, I harvested this many Thai peppers. So again, thinking about where do I have sun, where it works, how can I put some things in terms of a space that you might not typically think of. So now let's talk about our soil, especially if we're planting in the ground. You wouldn't have to do this if you're going to do container gardens or boxes and you're going to buy soil. But so properties of soil. Soils need to be nutrient rich. So we look at nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So those are the NPK that you see on a fertilizer bag. And then there's a ton of trace elements that the plants need. So the proper soil pH range for a garden is typically 6 to 7. So if you remember from when you were in school, 1 is totally acidic, 14 is alkaline, and 7 is neutral. So you want it to be just a little bit acidic. Doesn't mean that you can't grow things if your soil pH is, much higher or is much lower, but it will mean that the plants cannot necessarily access some of those trace elements that are in the soil if the pH is sort of off that mark. So there's things you can do over time to help improve the pH of your soil. The other thing you want in terms of properties of healthy soil or soil that's well drained, it's not compacted, and that's friable. Interesting word, and we'll talk about that. The overall conditions of the soil, the physical condition is this idea of tilth. And tilth is how good is your soil in terms of all these factors, the moisture content, the kinds of soil particles that you have, whether there's room for aeration. If it's very full of clay, you don't get a lot of aeration, and the roots can sometimes rot because there's no way for the water to drain out. So there's a link there for building healthy soils, and again, that's on the list of references that we provided. So what you can do is you can test the chemical properties. It's an easy thing to do. Virginia Tech has a soil lab. You can get boxes like this from the Fairlington. Actually, on the next slide, I'm going to tell you. Costs $16 a sample if you have them test for everything. So you can get supplies in this area from Fairlington, from the community center. I believe now that it's open, so you can actually go inside. I guess I should have updated that. That's from when the center was closed down during COVID. There's some other locations locally. You can mail your samples to Virginia Tech, to the soil testing lab. So you get a box like this, you close it up. It looks just like it does on the diagram. You can download the form from that link on the website. I believe if you're outside our area, you can use Virginia Tech to test your soil. Typically, you need about 3/4 of a cup of soil to send off. And so you could put 3/4 of a cup in a Ziploc bag and maybe ship it to them. I'm not sure. You might want to call them and check, I guess, for sure. On the back of this form, it shows you actually how to do your soil sample. So what you can do is you can sample, say you have 3 or 4 plots where you grow in your garden area or in your along your driveway or wherever it is. It tells you how to take multiple samples, say maybe 10, in sort of a zigzag pattern, going deeper than just the surface, putting it in the bucket, mixing it all up well, letting it dry out, and then you put it into this box, and then you mail it to them, and you fill out this form where you tell them what you're going to grow in that spot, because it's not just for vegetables. If you can use this to test the soil for your lawn or for fruit or other shrubs. And so you tell them, and they send all the results now by email. That's the only way that they sell it. So make sure that your email is really readable, and you'll send a check with it. And within about 2 weeks, except if it gets into prime season, now is a great time to do that. You just want to make sure that the soil is dried out, that you send them, and that you can get in and sort of dig up. So don't do it on a day like today. So let's test for friability. So the idea of friability is that you put your hand down, you get a chunk of your soil, and you squeeze it. If it just falls apart, that could mean that there's a lot of sand in the soil. If it totally stays together, it could mean that you have a lot of clay. If you can make a bunch, take a bunch and circle it, and then use your thumb and just see if it falls apart. If it falls apart, that's like a really nice balanced soil in terms of the content of the soil and the possibility that it's got good aeration and drainage. So do that. The solution, if it's not very friable and it's sort of very solid and clay-like, is you're going to add organic material. And as we get into it later, we'll talk more about that. But typically, it's compost and other organic materials. You want to test then for compaction. So you want these air pockets in the soil, because that allows the water and all these nutrients we've talked about to actually reach the roots, which are going down into the soil. So if you have a lot of foot traffic, or if you've had construction, or you just have, you can have crappy soil. They take the topsoil away a lot when they do build a house or do some kind of construction, and they don't really bring it back. And so what you have left is not always all that good. So if you take a garden fork like this here, and you can push it into the ground without stepping on it, the soil is pretty good and it's not compacted. And you can test that anytime. If you can't get it in without putting your foot on it, you're going to want to start to work on adding organic matter to your soil, and you'll want to turn it some and break up some of the large clods. And And what you want to do, and we'll show you that later when we talk about garden planting, is you're going to want to start to decide where you're planting and where you're not, because what you don't want to do is step on your soil and have that foot traffic and compact it, because here you are, you're trying to break it up and plant things in it and leave room for the roots to grow easily. If you're walking on it all the time, you're just going to keep compacting it. So I try to have dedicated paths in my garden. I think that's just better. The other thing you want to do then is you want to test for drainage. So what you do is you dig a hole 1 foot deep, 1 foot wide, you fill it with water, and you leave it overnight. You don't want to do this after heavy rain like we're having down here today, or when it's really, really cold. So when it's not rain for a week or so, you want to do this. So what you want to do is fill it, come back the next day, put something over at the top like that. It's just a bamboo pole. And then you want to fill it with water again. And then you want to check every hour to see how much the water has drained down. You're hoping for well, at least an inch an hour. 2 is great. And that will tell you again how your drainage is. Otherwise, what that tells you, if it's not draining at least somewhere between 1 to 3 inches an hour, that you're going to need to amend it with organic materials. You may want to think about raised beds so that you raise the soil actually up above some of that compacted soil, so that you have a growing medium that's not compacted. And the other thing you want to think about is right plant, right place. Because if you have poor drainage, some of the things that grow deep, like or grow into the ground, and that's what you're harvesting, like carrots and beets, potatoes for sure, they can end up rotting because we have these heavy rains, and then the water sits, and the plants bulbs or roots are in that soil, and they can't breathe, and so they may not do well. Where things like tomatoes and peppers, although they have roots that go down, they have a little bit more flexibility. And so that's one of the things that you're going to want to think about, and you're going to want to know. I mean, it happened to us one year. We planted a new garden. We planted potatoes. They weren't doing well. When we went to see what was going on, why was the plant rotting? When I actually put a fork in and started to kind of dig up to look, I heard this sucking sound, and it was water that we had a lot of rain, and water was just sitting on top of the clay layer, right underneath where the potatoes are starting to form, and the plant just rotted. We lost it. So raised beds offer an advantage. It's just that there's more cost, right? You need lumber, but there's advantages of it. You get better drainage. You can get higher yields because you have this better root growth, because you have this improved soil. Now you have to not only buy the lumber, but you're going to have to buy soil to fill the beds, and that could take a lot. But you make an investment, and then over time you get to reap the benefits of it. You can get this expanded growing season because it dries faster and the water won't sit as long, and it warms up a little bit faster in the spring, which is kind of nice. And for some people, they like it because you can put 6-inch sides, you can put in 12-inch sides. They find it sometimes a little bit easier for weeding. Sometimes you can use a stool and sit and work in the bed, and it's kind of nice for that. And lastly, if you have sites like rooftops or solid rock, or even on your driveway, sometimes you can or some kind of hard surface, you can actually put raised beds on surfaces to have a growing area. Another option are containers, and containers, I'm not just talking sort of the round containers that are pretty that you get. You can use 5-gallon buckets. You can use any kind of something that's like a couple foot and 5-gallon or 10-gallon. Hanging baskets, grow bags are popular. They're like felts, and you can grow tomatoes in those, and peppers, and even lettuces and stuff like that. So you have a lot of options of things that you can grow in that would be a container, nominally a container. If you're going to want them to be mobile, you got to figure out some kind of a dolly, because let me say that when you get these things filled with dirt and then you're watering them and they're wet, they can be very heavy to move, and you don't want to hurt yourself. But you need to select a container that's deep enough for plant roots. So those 5-gallon ones are kind of handy, and you can make holes in them for drainage and that. We're not going to get into containers specifically here a lot, but there's a couple really good references there on the bottom. And our colleague Ann Reed taught a class last year on outdoor container gardening that's really, really good. And she even shows some examples of setting up the containers and all. So we highly recommend that. So as we come to the end of step 1, let's look here at some of the places that you might decide that you want to grow something based on where you live. And what you've learned in terms of learning about the soil. So one is an apartment or a townhouse. You may have a balcony, you may have a bed nearby, you may have a patio, you may even have some kind of common area. I plant in our common area by our townhouses and share with our neighbors, and so they're happy that I have basil and I have flowers and stuff in there that I planted for pollinators. You may have a house, so you may be able to have a dedicated garden bed or flower bed that you can plant in. Again, you may have a balcony or a patio there where you can put containers. Again, you can use the driveway. I've seen where people have gone down the length of their driveway with 5-gallon buckets filled with tomatoes with some kind of supports or peppers. And it works out really well for them. Or there's a health strip. That's that area between your sidewalk and the street that's green, and it might be green with grass. It might barely be green with grass. And that might be something that you want to consider making productive and perhaps more beautiful. There's also the idea of a community garden. For us here in Northern Virginia, we have community gardens in Fairfax, in Arlington, and Alexandria. Often you have to get on the wait list, but they turn over sometimes pretty quickly because people change their mind and move away. So I definitely recommend that. And you can get some help from the help desk on that information if you can't find it. You may have a friend with a garden or a family member with a garden, and maybe they'd be happy to have you come and garden and share some of what you grow. You could also do a kitchen garden and grow some things inside. They have these tiny tomato plants that you can buy now. So if you have a sunny location, you might be able to do that. And it's possible to grow herbs inside if you have a spot. Again, if you don't have sun, there are grow lights that you can buy. So if you really want to have something inside, you can do that. Last thing, if you don't have any places, all those different options, think about volunteering at a school garden, at a church garden, or volunteering at a community garden, just to kind of get yourself started and get your hands dirty and kind of get some of the benefits of gardening. So that's the end of step one. We can take any questions here now, Colleen.
All righty. There was a question about your sun map. What time of year would you do that? And would you wait until trees leaf out?
Best time to do it is midsummer at sort of the height of the days. But if you're trying to figure out a spot, there's nothing wrong with doing it now, but keeping in mind where your trees are that will leaf out. And then you could do it again at the high time of the summer and sort of confirm and see if there's any additional knowledge that you might get. I wouldn't want to wait, especially if you're trying to pick a spot now and then you find out it's not a great spot because it had all the shade that you hadn't thought about. Once you start thinking about it and looking at it, like just having maybe sat through this, all of a sudden you'll realize there's some areas that are not sunny that you thought were, or vice versa. So,
okie doke. Someone had a question about whether to use horse or cow manure and how much to use, and are there any adverse effects for humans or human health?
I think we're going to talk about that in detail in later, but no adverse effects on humans. It gets used all the time. It needs to be aged. Sometimes you can buy it commercially, but you can get it from farms. Some people use it and put it into compost, and as a component of the compost that they're aging. So it's a good source.
Okie doke.
The help desk can provide people details on how much and for their situation.
And do you have recommendations for types of soil to put in a container?
On
We'll
that,
talk about that later in the presentation.
okay, good. There you go.
Okay.
Okay, step 2 of our 9 steps is preparing and caring for your soil. And you may have noticed as Donna was talking, the solution to the drainage and tilth issues she identified was always adding organic material. And when it comes to promoting good soil health and maintaining soil health, compost is probably one of the best tools that the gardener has available. What compost is shredded leaves, twigs, it could be kitchen scraps from vegetables, untreated grass clippings that have decomposed to the point that you can no longer tell what the original material was. And when you add it to soil, it's kind of like magic. It improves aeration, it improves drainage, it improves water holding capacity. And as the compost further decomposes in the soil, it creates a reservoir of slow release nutrients that plants really like. You can make your own, or you can purchase it commercially. If you're going to make it your own, you can check out our videos on the Master Gardener Virtual Classroom. If you're going to use a commercial product, you want to look for a product that says it meets the guidelines of the U.S. Composting Council. The U.S. Composting Council sets guidelines for what goes into compost, the quality of what goes in, as well as contaminants that might be there. So most new gardens start out as on areas that are currently covered with lawn or weeds or some mixture of the two. There may also be some rocks or branches lying on the ground. You're going to want to remove the rocks and branches that are laying around, and you're going to need to remove the lawn and weeds before you can plant in that space. And there's a couple of different ways to remove the lawn and weeds. One is mechanical, and you do that using perhaps a garden fork, a rototiller, a shovel, where you physically loosen the soil, turn it over, and then shake the soil off the roots of the weeds and or lawn and throw those away. Depending on how much time you have available before you want to plant, you can also smother the grass and weeds. The generic term that applies to that approach is called no-till gardening. And you may also hear it as lasagna gardening or sheet composting. And basically the principle is really simple. You lay down something like cardboard or a thick layer of newspaper, put organic materials on top of those. Once the organic materials have decomposed, you plant right in that decomposed material without turning the soil over. If you're doing the mechanical version, about 3 weeks before you're ready to plant, you're also going to work in your compost, manure, and any fertilizers or other amendments recommended by your soil test. You're going to work that into the top 4 to 6 inches of your soil using a garden fork. The reference that we've given to you at the bottom is for a no-till reference from the University of Maryland. They use existing compost in this example. And knowing how anxious all of you will be to start your gardening, if you want to do a no-till garden, this is a great place to start. For an existing garden, you also are going to have to remove any weeds that came up over the winter, and they will come up. And you're also going to want to add compost to your beds. If you can, it's a great idea to add your compost in the fall of the preceding year, but if you haven't, you can add it now. Again, 1 to 2 inches, work into the top 4 to 6 inches of your soil. The thing to know about soil health is that it's a long-term commitment, and you're going to be adding large amounts of organic material to your soil over several years. One interesting thing that you may notice over time is that the more organic material you've added to your soil tests will show less and less needs for supplemental amendments. In addition to compost, you could also consider doing cover crops to add organic matter. And Donna will talk about that more, I think, in our presentation next week. One thing that we would encourage you to do is to resist rototilling and turning the soil completely in an existing garden bed. It's really not good for the soil health, and it exposes weeds to the surface. And as Donna will talk about later, weed seeds never die. You got enough to take care of without adding more weeds to your soil. Another thing to consider is using a broad fork to aerate your soil. There's a picture on the right-hand side of this slide. You push the broad fork into the ground, you rock it back and forth, you move it 6 or 8 inches over your flower bed, and it aerates the whole space without turning the garden soil over. The type of soil you use in a raised bed is going to depend on what kind of raised bed that you have. There's two examples on this slide, but there's more information on the link on the bottom for people who may be using raised beds in other situations. If your garden is basically in good shape, you can create a raised bed simply by mounding the soil in your garden bed and mixing it with 2 to 4 inches of compost using a garden fork or spade. You can also, if you have good topsoil, dig paths between your raised area and add that to your raised area to increase the depth. If you're doing a new framed raised bed, something that's got sides around it, whether it's, wooden or cement block or bales of straw, whatever you're using, and it's on a soil that's kind of clay, you again want to break up that soil underneath like you would in an existing garden. And you can use a garden fork or a spade or the broad fork and dig that into the garden, rock it back and forth every 6 to 8 inches. Then you can fill the bed with a mixture of compost and purchased topsoil at a 1:2 or 1:1 ratio. Another option would be to fill the bed with a mixture of compost and a soilless growing mix in a 1:1 ratio. And as I mentioned earlier, the link on the bottom and on your handout gives other examples. The growing medium that you use in containers is really important because there's a relatively small amount of it compared to what a plant would have available in an in-ground setting. And in an in-ground setting, a plant can, if there's not enough nutrients or moisture in the existing area, a plant can send out roots to the surrounding area to find that needed moisture or nutrients. They can't do that in a container. What's within the walls of the container is all that's available. So you want to select a high quality organic potting soil mix that will provide good structure and nutrients. Don't use soil from your garden. In addition to having insects or weeds or possibly disease in it, the clay in the soil will hold too much water and it'll rot the roots of your plant. Virginia Tech advises avoiding against using soilless mixes as well. And the main reason is that it's very light. If you try to grow a tomato in a lightweight plastic pot with a soilless mix, a strong wind could actually come by and knock the whole thing over, which is not going to be good for your plant or wherever it falls on. Another thing to avoid are these soil mixes that come with water absorbing polymer products. They're advertised as a way to not have to water as much because those polymers hold water. But what happens is if the polymers dry out, they'll actually pull moisture out of the tiny root hairs of your plant and damage them. Any questions about garden soil preparation?
There was a question about whether you would ever add compost to the potting soil.
Definitely add compost to potting soil.
Okay. Any recommendations for the kind of garden fork to use?
I'll tell you, mine just came from a hardware store. It's got 4 prongs on it. It's pretty generic, and it was probably the most inexpensive one that they had. I think what changes is the width of the prongs. Mine works just fine.
Okay. And is there any level that's too deep for tilling or turning the soil?
If you are, one of the reasons that people advise using tillers is sometimes tillers can dig down like 6 to 8 inches. And what happens in that circumstance is sometimes the soil amendments and the compost gets too low, deeply buried for the, especially for shallow rooted plants to reach the nutrients that are provided. So you really, stay within the top 4 to 6 inches.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what the difference between a soilless mix and a potting soil?
I can't tell you a lot. There's no regulations that govern what's in potting soil versus a soil mix. But there's actually, no, I can't tell you the difference. I have seen written things about them, but I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
Okie doke. And what kind of soil would you use to sprout seeds?
Always use a seed starting mix.
Okay. And can potting soil be reused?
It can. What happens is the only time you don't want to reuse it is like if you're growing tomatoes and you've got like wilt or something on your tomatoes, then you want to get rid of it, or if there's been any disease in your plants. Otherwise, what you do is you take out the top half, third to a half, and take what's left, dump it out on a tarp or something, and get the weeds, or not the weeds, but the root material, any organic material that's in there from the leftover first plant, and then mix that at a 50-50 or a 2/3, 1/3 mix with new potting soil. So you're getting the nutrients from the new potting soil mixed in with the old potting soil. You may find that you have to add some supplemental fertilizer to it that you wouldn't have if you were using just a fresh commercial mix, but you can do it.
Okay. Susan, could you use a 5-gallon container to grow potatoes or carrots?
I don't know. Donna, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, I've done it. I don't know if it's as productive as growing in the ground, but actually you can. I've used both grow bags and 5-gallon buckets, and I got a couple of pounds of potatoes.
Okay. We talked about horse and cow manure. Can you use guinea pig manure, for instance?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay, they can check with the help desk. Okay, that's good for questions for now.
Okay. Hope you get a lot from that guinea pig. All right, so we've gone through this whole idea of thinking through where you can plant, and when you start to think about what you have available to you, what you might need to do to possibly improve the soil in that area, or if you're going to do some kinds of containers, what kind of soil you're going to need to buy, or if you're going to put in raised beds. Now let's talk about planning your garden layout. And part of that is, first of all, to think about what you want to plant, because vegetables take different amounts of space. One of the handouts that we gave you is called Recommended Spacing for Vegetable Planting. And the first column in it talks about how many seeds to sow per foot. But then what's more important is the distance between plants when you plant them sort of in rows. And so it ranges anywhere from a couple inches to 1.5 to 3 feet. And so you really need to think about what it is you want to grow, and think about the space that you have available to you so that you can have enough room for the things you want to grow. So here's a bunch of, not everything, but here's because I realize okra is not on there, and that's something that I like to grow, but here's a bunch of different vegetables that are that you can grow in this area. All of these things are possible to grow, and I see them in the community gardens, but this is not the total list. If you go to the link at the bottom, you can find out a lot of information about each of those vegetables, plus others, plus herbs. But what you want to think about is, what do you like to eat? Do you want to grow something? Are you working with kids? Do you have children? There's some things that are really fun to grow with kids, like say radishes and beans and peas, perhaps, green beans for sure, tomatoes and peppers. So if you have kids, you might want to grow something like that because they're fun. Or some people might say, I don't want to grow radishes. I buy them at the store. They're cheaper at the store. I'd rather grow something I can't get at the store. And so you might want to grow some really hot peppers because you're a hot pepper person. Or you might want to grow some variety of eggplant that you don't commonly maybe see in the store, and you can buy seeds for it. So part of it is thinking about what do you want to have, keeping in mind that if you follow organic gardening practices, you're going to be having an organic garden. So everything that you're buying are organic vegetables, which actually would cost more in the grocery store. So this is kind of exciting because you're going to have very healthy produce in the garden. So looking at that, let's also look at how you think about selection. So one thing to think about is sort of this idea of quality and taste. Do things taste better when they come direct from the garden? And I'll tell you that there's nothing like tomatoes from your own garden. Peppers from your own garden, even parsley. You sort of think, well, parsley is parsley, but something about parsley cut fresh and used that day. It's almost like a whole different plant. We've grown edamame, soybeans, and soybeans are fantastic fresh from the garden. So you want to think about that quality and taste. Think about the effort to grow. How much time do you have? Are you a first out gardener? What do you want to grow that's easy? And so I'll tell you things like, beans are easy. radishes are easy. I think tomatoes and peppers are easy. Squash is easy. We're going to teach you about some of the things you have to worry about in terms of pests and diseases later, but those are things that might be easy to grow. You want to think about the size of the mature plant. So things like tomatoes can take up a lot of space, especially if they're not trellised or have supports, which we'll talk about. Same with like cucumbers, but there's a lot of things that we can grow tall. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And growing things tall, let you make a little bit more use of your space. So low, you can grow things like lettuces, which aren't too tall, and radishes, which don't need a lot of space and will come out early. And then you can have other things that grow up tall. So you could, for instance, have radishes encircling a zucchini plant. And by the time the zucchini plant is really getting big and shadowing, the radishes are done. You can also think about the idea of low yield versus high yield. For instance, you might grow pumpkins. So I grew pumpkins one year. Somebody gave me a plant. And I said, all right, I'll grow it. I got like 2 or 3 of these really cute little tiny pumpkins. And I was able to send one off to my granddaughter in California, which she loved. But it took up, a fair amount of space, even though I grew it vertically, for like a couple of 3 small pumpkins, where I could have used that space maybe for pole beans and gotten a lot more out of that space. But it's what you want to grow and what makes you happy. If what made you happy was pumpkins, and grow pumpkins. You also want to think about things like days to harvest. When we look at varieties, things can vary as much as 2 weeks in terms of things that have a short harvest time or days to maturity. That's what it'll say on the packages, days to maturity. And so like radishes can be as little as 23 days and it can be as much as 30, or if you grow watermelon radishes, they could be 60. Also, you want to think about disease resistance, and we'll talk about that a lot more later, actually next week. But they'll have some indications about that on some of the seed packets. I'll talk about heirlooms and hybrids in a minute. And then there are some plants that are suited to our area, like some seed companies will actually, like Southern Exposure Seed Company, they actually are in the area, and they'll talk about things that are good for this sort of mid-Atlantic southern area, which is kind of nice because that means that they know things that are good for our heat and humidity. There are other companies like Johnny's, which is up in Maine, and so they might be able to give you more information about plants that are better suited to sort of the New England area. So there's some advantage to using sources that are nearby, that are in your area in terms of getting some of your seeds, but not totally necessary. The link at the bottom is it's what they call a citizen science project, where you can get an account, and then you can look and see what people are recommending for your area. And you can enter information to say things that you've tried and sort of report on how well it did. And so that's kind of a nice thing. The other thing is, if you're in, say, a community garden or your neighbors have gardens, talk to them about what they've grown and what they like that did well. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So let's talk about heirlooms and hybrids briefly, just because you'll see those words. So heirlooms are seeds from plants that have been saved and grown for years. And in fact, for decades, that was how our ancestors grew seeds. I mean, grew and gardened. They would grow things. They would let them go to seed. They would save the seed. That was really important. And they would have it for the next year. And that's what they did for decades. As we were starting to get into more of an industrial age, where people wanted to ship vegetables and have vegetables last long and not to have so much problem because they were growing in large fields, and they wanted to start to have less problems with some of the diseases and some of the pests that can be a problem for some plants. And so in agriculture centers, they started to experiment with things that they could do to take the best seeds from plants that did well against disease and pest and continue to improve those. Now, some people say that heirlooms have a better flavor, and they favor those. Those will be the tomatoes you find. They're kind of ugly. They're not very uniform in shape, and they have different shapes and colors. The other thing is they may not store or travel well, but they taste excellent. The thing is they're open pollinated. So that means that they're good for seed saving. And so you can use those seeds. And because they're not coming from two different parents, those plants, when you save the seeds, you'll get the same tomato out of that plant following years. Hybrids, because they're a cross between genetically different parents, you can save seeds from them, But the problem is that when you grow those plants out the next year, they're not going to be the same necessarily as that hybrid that you grew first. It may favor one or the other of the parents. And so generally what you have to do is buy the seeds again, or use, save seeds from the packet and go again. So like when you see those tomatoes in the store and there's like 3 in a packet and they look exactly the same, those are typically hybrids that have been bred to have good staying power and look good and store well. So it's just your preference. It depends on how you find in your area if you're having a problem with pests and all. There's nothing wrong with hybrids, and heirlooms aren't the answer to everything. It's kind of nice for you to just try in your experience both. Let's talk a little bit about tomatoes, because this is important to know because of space, because here we're going to plant our garden and we want to talk a little bit about space. So there are 2 terms that you need to know about tomatoes: determinate and indeterminate. So determinate tomatoes, they tend to grow maybe up to like 5 foot, maybe. And they get a lot of clusters with a few leaves between them. And then the shoots will terminate in like this cluster. And because they're smaller plants and they don't keep growing, they're really good for caging, or you can even let them sprawl, or you can grow them in a container. And in fact, when you look at those tags on plants at the nursery or at the big box store, they'll say a container tomato. They'll also often say determinate. And now that you know to look for that, you'll know. Or they'll say a patio plant or patio tomato. They say that too for things like cucumbers and other things that maybe are more bushy. And that's what they mean by that. They're suitable for a smaller space and they're not going to be as sprawling. Thing on determinants is they tend to ripen kind of all at once, and then at some point the plant is kind of going to be done. I mean, this is still over a few months, but it doesn't like go, say, till October, usually. Indeterminates, they don't terminate in this flower cluster. They just keep elongating and they keep growing larger. And not only are they suited for staking and caging, you really have to stake and cage them. And they'll just have fruit ripen throughout the growing season. Again, if it gets really hot, like we have in our area here in Virginia, they might slow down, but they'll pick up again in late August, September, and they'll keep going until August, till really first frost. Those sometimes can grow to as much as really 8 to 10 feet. I mean, if you've grown like a Sungold cherry tomato plant, I've seen them go 10 foot. And what sometimes happens is if you have a row of cages and say 4 or 5 in a row, and hopefully you have taller cages, like those ones that they sell for 36 or 48 inches are typically not tall enough for an indeterminate. What will happen is they'll grow out the top of the cage, and they'll grow over the top of the other cages, and you'll kind of have like a tomato hedge, which is fine because they have somewhere to grow and they have somewhere to stay off the ground, and it's kind of beautiful. But you just want to keep that in mind, those little cages that they sell. We'll show you some examples later of trellising, of cages you can use for trellising that work better. So let's talk about temperature requirements and timing. So cool season crops are the peas, the lettuce, the spinach, the cold crops, the broccoli, the cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. They tolerate frost. They tolerate these cold temperatures under 50 degrees. And then as things warm up and the days get longer, the quality of them will actually deteriorate. And you can kind of tell they start to get the brown edges, they start to flower, the leaves become bitter, and they're not that tasty unless maybe you throw them into soup. The warm season crops, the ones which maybe you're most familiar with, they like temperatures over 50. They're killed by the frost, whether it's a late frost in the spring or whether it's the frost in the fall. And those are the things like beans and all. And not only do they like these differences in air temperature, but we're going to give you a slide later, I guess next week, where we actually talk about soil temperatures and how soil temperatures impact the plants germinating and actually once they germinate, doing well. So that's kind of good to know. So we have this chart. Everybody should have gotten this, an electronic version of this chart. Again, this is for our area. Depending on the zone you're in, you'll have to modify it a little bit in terms of the dates, say at the top. My mom was on Long Island, or lived on Long Island, and so for her, it turned out she was actually in like zone 7, which I would have never guessed. But I guess it's more temperate because of the water, and this actually was pretty good for them. So what you can see here is just for a bunch of vegetables. It's not alphabetical; it's more by timing. What you can plant now. So March 1st is next Tuesday, So that's in purple. And then what's in yellow is sort of an overlap time where you can plant and harvest. And then green is when you start to harvest, depending on when you actually planted it. And so this is really handy. I keep a copy of this at my garden so I can remind myself of things. And the link at the bottom will take you to an electronic copy of it if you somehow didn't get it, the email. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. So let's look at some design considerations for an in the ground or a raised bed garden. You want to think about the size of the garden. I like to put paths, paths between my rows because I don't want to walk on my garden beds. Not everybody does that. I do that. I think it's just easier. I can put some newspaper down to keep the weeds from coming up in the paths and just worry about where I'm planting. Some people use 1 to 2 foot rows. A lot of people now are using more intensive planting practices and they get to wider beds like 3 to 4 foot wide. I don't suggest getting much wider than 4 foot in terms of like say the length of the bed or the width of the bed, because then you find yourself stepping into the bed. Now, sometimes we put some stepping stones in some of our beds so that we can have a place to sort of consistently step rather than, mashing it down all over. But what you want to do is start thinking about what you want to plant, what you're thinking about, and then you're going to look at the chart that I sent you that sort of tells you at a glance for a bunch of vegetables how far apart they're going to need when they're mature, so that you can start to think about how much room do I have? How many tomato plants could I really fit that makes sense? Is there ways for me to take advantage of growing things up versus just having it all be low? For tall plants, we get back to this idea of sun and shading. We talked about tree shading. Well, your tall crops can actually shade your shorter crops. So you want to plant your tall crops on the north side of your plot if you can, or the west side. So as the sun comes up and it's going over, and all that stuff is getting shade until afternoon when the tall crops start to sort of shade some of it. As you start to get into things later, like crop rotation and not planting things in the same place, that may be a little bit more difficult, but we just want you to keep in mind that some of the tall crops, like those tomatoes that I said are 5 foot tall, can definitely shade. And later, as you're trying to protect some of the lettuces from getting too hot too soon, that's an advantage, right? Because if the tomatoes are tall, they can shade the lettuces that are down low or the other greens. So you want to allow for ease of working in the garden, making as much use as space as you can while giving the plants room to grow. If you have a slope, you want to plant across the slope, not up and down. You may even need to terrace it if it's a steep slope versus trying to grow the rows down it. You'll have to kind of see for your situation. So let's go to a couple of well, here's a chart. Okay, I forgot. So here's the spacing. So when I was talking about spacing between rows, so asparagus takes a whole bunch of space. Things like bush beans, the rows can be 18 to 24 inches apart. But if you're going to sow seeds, so if you're going to plant 6 in a foot, that means you're going to plant the bush beans 2 inches apart. You could actually plant like in intensive gardening, kind of like a bed where you plant them 2 inches apart in each direction and have like kind of a little section of beans. And I'll show that in the next map. And so I like to do that a lot just to take advantage of my space, especially because I'm planting in most of my beds are 3 and 4 foot wide. But the handout has a lot more vegetables on it, and that's just a one pager that you can print out. The other thing to think about before we actually get to planning this next, looking at some specific plans for a garden are spaces for your trellises, both because you're going to need to have these spaces to support your plants when you get started, because when you plant, you want to put them in so that you're not damaging the roots, a month later. And the other thing is you actually need space for the supports so that you can get around your plants. So in the upper left corner here, this is reinforcing fencing, and it comes in sheets, and you can cut it down and make like a cage like that. And that's kind of nice. The material is really strong. It lasts a long time. That's in Susan's garden, and she's using that for some of her tomatoes. Next to that's a teepee. And so I've used that for beans, where at the bottom I stake it, and then I come to a pole that's in the middle and I tie it up. And then I plant beans at the bottom by each of the stakes, and that works out well. Here you have containers. These are actually tubs. And in the tubs, they put some kind of a wooden trellising that's kind of nice. And you can see they have some cherry tomatoes growing on that, hopefully a patio type, and some nice looking peppers. Down here, you have a trellising arrangement for some squashes and some tomatoes. That's nice. In the middle here, you can buy twine that's set up like that, like a lattice, and then you can put up some kind of support structure and then and then spread the lattice along it. You can put beans or peas at the bottom and let it grow up it, or cucumbers. Down here on the lower left is these are some 2-part tomato cages. And like I was telling you, this is my mom's garden, and she plants in her flower bed in between some bushes. And this is probably just August. And you can see how tall they are already. And these are like 5-foot cages or close to it. And by the time the season was done in September, October up there, it grew up the cage, and then it went over to the cage next to it. So it was quite spreading. So here's our 10-foot by 10-foot garden. So here's just an example. On the left is the shopping list of possible things. So a couple tomato plants, they're larger sized tomatoes, some sungolds, which are small, one of my favorites, a couple 5 kinds of peppers, cukes, radishes. So not too much, not too bad, gives you a pretty good variety. So say you have a 10-foot by 10-foot bed or space. Here's how you can set out your beds. Each square is a foot, and I put in 18-inch paths. So here's some examples where I'm going to plant tomatoes across the top here, 18 to 36 inches apart, so there's room for airflow. In front, I'm going to plant some, a couple 3 foot of radishes, and I'm going to thin them to at least 1 inch. We'll talk about thinning and some of that later. In this middle bed, I'm going to plant peppers, and then I'm going to plant some cucumbers and hills, and we'll talk about what hilling is later. So that will be next week. We'll talk about that. And then in the bottom, I'm thinking, let's put some bush beans in, let's put some squash. So here's an example where I thought about, here's some of the things I want to grow. Here's some of the kinds of things I've checked against the chart to know spacing. And then I'd probably add in some basil and some marigolds and some zinnias because I want to bring in some pollinators. And the bed is facing, it's north at the top. So I'm planting my tall things, my tomatoes at the top. So that's an example there. Just a quick, simple example. So let's go to some other garden layouts. Here's an interesting garden layout where you have these angle beds in the corner, and the center is a pollinator bed. And this was my friend's garden, who's my neighbor next to me. The thing I found with this is it's a little hard to work in these angle beds. I sort of like the long beds, but it's really quite pretty. And in the middle are all these pathways, which are mulched, which is nice. And so you see a lot of different things there, a lot of tomatoes and a lot of peppers, because that's what she likes. We can see over here, we have a squash, and you say, why is this winter squash here? Well, that was a volunteer. It was a seed that was in the compost that we hadn't quite gotten hot enough. And so it started to grow, and we let it stay there. So you see, we have a couple, 3 of those where we had some winter squash that grew, and we let it grow. And in that case, we let it grow on the ground. So this is her garden in the spring, in the fall, after the season was done. The tomatoes are all out. We have actually some cover crop here, but it sort of shows you what it looked like for real and not just a diagram. This is a food bank garden that we grew last 2020. And so this bed here in the foreground, we just planted tomatoes. We were trying to plant tomatoes for the food bank. We had about 13 plants there, and we had just planted them, so they haven't yet filled up the cages. Some of these cages are the short ones that I'm recommending, and not recommending, but we had them, they were free, and so we used those. In the center here, in the middle bed, we had 3 kinds of squash. In the back bed here, we had some leftover lettuce from the early spring planting, and we were trying to protect it from the deer. So that's row cover, and that's some tall hoops, and it's pinned at the bottom. And surprisingly, the deer just left it alone. And then this bed down here, we covered it with burlap, and we had some carrots. That's an example. There's another short bed. It's not too big. It's 4 foot by 10. So you could plant some similar things there. Here's another food bank bed. And so we had tomatoes in the top bed here, and in the middle, the square bed over to the right, we had zucchini. The bed you can hardly see, we had all beans. We had more zucchini in this next bed, and coming to the bottom, we had peppers. So this was again at the early point of the season where we had just started out, and you can see we sort of set up our beds. We set up some paths, filled them with wood chips, and just made it easy. So we're just working on beds. A couple other I'm going to go through this really quickly because we're running out of time. A couple opportunities to increase your yield. There's an idea of succession planting. It's extending the crop by making efficient use of space and timing. So you could do this idea of the same crop and multiple plantings. And so that was what I showed you on the 10 by 10 foot bed, where you planted radishes every 2 weeks. You planted it in a section instead of all at once, that they didn't all mature at the same time. The other idea is you can take the same crop like radishes or beans, and you can get different maturity date varieties And the idea is you can plant them all at the same time, but because they have different maturity dates, again, they won't all harvest and be ready at the same time, which is kind of nice. If there's only a few people in your family, you may not want all your radishes at the same time or all your beans. And you can do the same thing with beans. Another idea is that you can do 2 more crops in succession. And well, I think the next chart, we'll look at it here. So the idea is we were talking about, we have a long period, 180 to 210 days. So your first planting could be the radishes, the greens, or the cole crops. And so that's what I'm showing you there. Those are some of the examples. Then for your warm weather, you can then plant your squash or your potatoes or your peppers or tomatoes. And they have obviously a longer season. And as they're starting to not really peak, but you're harvesting a lot of them, but some things are starting to be done, then you could start to think about what you want to plant in terms of a fall and maybe even into winter. And I actually teach a class on that, and it's been recorded. That's on the in the virtual classroom. Again, if you're a starting gardener, let's just look at this bottom level down here, and let's just think about planting maybe warm weather crops and see if you like it, and not get yourself too overwhelmed. And then as you like it, you start to think about, maybe I'll add in some fall stuff because I sure would like to see if I can get some greens, or you can wait. And in the spring, like now, you'd be planting things like radishes or beets or something like that. So don't be overwhelmed. This is just to throw the idea out there so that when you hear about succession planting, you know what it is. And then the last thing you can do is there's this idea of companion or interplanting. And the idea is that some things benefit each other. And if you plant them together, things like legumes, like peas and beans, actually capture nitrogen. And that's nice because things like tomatoes and peppers and squash are big nitrogen users. And so if you can plant something like a bean and then plant some things nearby that need nitrogen, you can actually benefit the 2 plants. The other thing is this idea of heights. If you plant lettuces in the shade of the heat lovers, you can have lettuce last longer while the tomatoes are getting larger, or even the peas, or things don't compete. And there's a good reference there that you can look at from Virginia State University. And lastly, last 2 is opportunities to attract beneficial insects. I never used to worry about flowers. I just didn't think I had space for it. And then my friend started that pollinator bed, and seeing the flowers that came in and the insects that were attracted to them. First of all, the flowers are beautiful and the insects were amazing. And so I realized that I was missing out, and I needed to do that. And so she has the pollinator bed, but I have little areas where I plant flowers. And sometimes that actually fools some of the insects that are not beneficial, and kind of keep them away while the beneficial ones can come in. And so you want to think about what you can plant and try to have flowers all the time. So early spring, then summer, and then fall. And there's some varieties that can help you in that area. So here's a really nice list of some of the pollinator selections. If you go to the link at the bottom, there's I think 23 plants on that list. Susan and I went through and looked at the list and put down things that we've actually grown ourselves that we can attest to being helpful. And actually the flowers at the bottom are from my garden. I think the calendula is the left one, and the next one over is a type of marigold. And then there's some hyssop, which is an amazing attractor of bees. And then the last one is zinnia, which attracts lots of butterflies and bees. So any one of these, and if it says P after it, it means it's a perennial here in our area. So that's even better because it'll come back. And some things like aster are a good fall pollinator selection. Hyssop will go like the whole season, which is great. Salvia will go the whole season. Then you have some herbs on there where you can plant them, you can harvest them to use in cooking, and then eventually let them go to flower, and then they'll attract lots of pollinators. So that is it. Questions?
Yes, we have a few. One left over from the last session. Can you put old potting soil into your garden beds?
Sure, as long as it didn't have diseased plants in it.
Okay.
If the plants that were growing in it ended up diseased, I wouldn't put it in a spot where I'm planting additional vegetables. You put it, somewhere maybe where you have shrubs or something. I mean, you don't necessarily want to throw dirt away, but throw it in the woods.
Okay, and do you all have preferred techniques for irrigating these beds you've been showing us?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that when we get to watering,
Okay.
which is next week.
And actually there was a question about whether you could trellis zucchini and watermelon, but a lot of the participants have already talked about how they do it.
Yep, you can. You can.
And finally,
So
where
did
can
somebody
you-
talk about a swing for the watermelon?
I think different kinds of trellising. I don't know if a sling was one of them.
Okay, anyway, okay, good.
And how about, where would you buy garden topsoil?
You can buy it at a nursery. It's called garden soil.
Okay,
I mean, you can buy it in bulk. And actually you could probably buy it in bulk at a nursery too, which might be cheaper if you need a lot. It would definitely be cheaper if you need a lot. Otherwise, they sell it in bags, like cubic foot.
You also, if you're buying it in bulk, you can ask the dealer for the soil test results on it, so you know what you're getting in terms of pH levels. And you can also ask how they've been storing it on site and if they've mixed it with anything before you purchase it.
oh, that's good to know. And finally, how close does the pollinator bed have to be to your garden?
Well, in our case, it's got, like you saw in that one picture, it's in the center. I guess if it's on the other side of the house, they'll find their way, they'll find their way. I mean, the closer the better, but just have it, if you're not doing, you can always tuck in a plant. You can tuck in a marigold here, or tuck in a basil plant there and let it go to flower. So.
Okay, that's good for questions for now.
Okay, step 4. Where are you going to get your seed, your plants? What equipment and supplies do you need for your garden? There's a couple of ways to get your vegetable plants. You might want to use seed. There are some plants that grow best when you put the seed directly into the garden. Another option is to purchase plants from a garden center, online source, or perhaps from a friend. The advantage of using purchased plants is that they fill the garden bed quickly and you don't have to worry about thinning, which we'll talk about later. You can grow your own transplants by starting seed indoors, and we'll talk about that later as well. You can allow seedlings to develop. If you have an existing garden, you may have some volunteers that come back year to year. That I've had that happen with cherry tomatoes in particular. And you also may be able to get plants from a friend. Many people who grow their own transplants from seeds always have a few extra, and you might have the perfect spot in your garden to give that extra plant a new home. What you're going to do is basically be a result of personal preference, plant type, time, and budget. And we'll talk about some of these things more as we go along. Here are some examples of some plants that you can direct sow. Things like beets and turnips, collards, greens, spinach, beans, melons, garlic, onions, and shallots, cilantro, parsley, and dill. You can, for almost all of these things, you can also use them as transplants, but seed works just fine, and sometimes it's easier. You can get your seed from a lot of different places. You can get it from local garden shops. I've seen it in the grocery store. You can get it from mail order sources, and Dona's already talked about some of the advantages of getting it from seed companies that are located where you're gardening. Another source might be friends and families. It's very unusual for a gardener to use all the seeds in their packets or all the seeds that they've purchased in a particular year. And a friend or a family member may be willing to share some seeds with you. Also, another option might be getting together with a friend who wants to grow the same thing you do and putting in a joint order. You can look at the seed package and see how many seeds are in the package to know whether that's a viable option or not. A couple of things about seed to keep in mind. You may see seed packages that say non-GMO on them and other packages that are silent on that issue. GMO stands for genetically modified organism. And the thing about GMO when it comes to seed that's sold to home gardeners is that no genetically modified seed is sold to home gardeners or to shops and stores that sell to home gardeners. So you can just take that off the table. It doesn't matter whether the package says non-GMO on it or not, it is not GMO. The other common question that people sometimes have is whether or not they should buy organic seed or use conventional seed. And that is basically a matter of personal preference. Organic seed is grown consistent with the National Organic Standards, which are the federal guidelines that gardeners have to meet in order to be certified as a USDA organic farmer. And one of the reasons that people like to buy organic seed is that it supports the soil building practices of organic farmers and ideally leads to less pesticide use, less erosion, and more biodiversity. That being said, organic seed is often more expensive than conventional seed. And while there's increasing amounts of organic seed available, there's still a lot of things that you might want to grow that are not available in organic seed. And you can actually grow conventional seed organically in an organic garden. And the National Organic Standards actually permit the use of conventional seeds under certain circumstances when they're not otherwise available. The package, your seed package, is an incredible source of information, and use it when you're laying out your garden and planting. It has a whole range of stuff in it. It can tell you how deep to plant it, spacing. What I really like is that, it tells you how long you should wait before you should see plants growing, sprouting. Then it gives you a maturity date for how long you need to work after that. It might include disease resistant information. It might have some horticultural tips, and sometimes it might talk about heat or coolness compatibility, because some types of plants will grow better or will grow into, when it gets warm, there are some seeds that are more heat tolerant than others of certain varieties. For buying transplants, if you're a first-time vegetable gardener, you might want to start out with transplants just because they're easier. And there's another good reason for using transplants, and that is for some plants, the growing season isn't long enough for you to get a harvest if you start from seed. And you may have noticed on the, the planting chart that Donna was referring to, there are asterisks after certain of the plants like cabbage and Brussels sprouts. Early March is a good time to plant those in our areas, but you have to do it with transplants. And the plants that have the asterisks on them are those plants. Similarly, if you were to put tomato seed in the ground and try to grow your tomato from seed, by the time you got your plant big enough, it would probably be too late in the season for you to actually get any plants themselves. When you're looking for your plants at your nursery or wherever you're getting them from, farmers market, you want to look for short, stocky plants that are an even green color. Look under the leaves to look for things like bugs or diseases. And the last thing you want to do is bring a bug or disease into your garden. The other thing you want to look at is the roots. The roots of the plant should be white in color, and you can slide the plant out of the container to check the root color. And there should be a fairly even balance between growing medium and roots. If you see roots coming out of the bottom of the plant, or if they're growing in a circular direction around the outside of the root ball, that's an early sign of stress. It means that the plant has probably started to outgrow its container and it's looking for nutrients or moisture that it can't find. Can you grow a plant that's root bound and still get produce? Sure, but if you can have a choice between a non-stressed plant and a plant that's been stressed, it just makes sense to go with the non-stressed plant. Growing your own transplants, there's pros and cons to each. The two biggest pros for growing your own transplants are that you have a much wider variety of plants available to you if you're looking for a specific type, for instance, and it's really a lot of fun. Having said that, there are some initial costs Startup costs, you need lights, you need containers, you need soil. But the biggest one is that the plants require nearly daily attention, sometimes twice a day for a good solid 2-month period in order to get plants. And that time commitment can be overwhelming. This is an example of a seed starting, just to sort of orient you to the steps. This is from Dona's seed starting a couple years ago. You start up in the top left-hand corner with the seeds in the seed tray on a heat pad. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you see the final results. There's 2 things I want to flag here for you if you're thinking about this. One is, if you notice the red dots in the 72 cell tray photo, that's how Dona has marked the different types of seedlings. And I can tell you from experience that if you lose your labels and you've grown more than one type of tomato or one type of pepper, it's almost impossible to tell which is which. So that's very important. The other thing I want to flag for you is the center photograph in the bottom. The lights that Dona's using are fixed. And so she's raised the containers using boxes to get the plants close enough to the lights to grow and avoid getting leggy transplants. Another question is, what kind of equipment do you need if the new gardener to start out? And our recommendation is to not get too much. There's a few key things you need, like you're going to need a shovel, a trowel for planting, maybe a hoe for weeding, something to water with. And because you're going to be really successful gardeners, you're going to need a trug or some kind of a basket for taking your harvest from the garden to your kitchen. In the center of this photograph, the tool with the orange handle is called a hori-hori knife. That's a very popular tool with master gardeners in our area. It's used for weeding and planting. It's got a jagged edge on one side that you can cut roots with. That being said, weeding tools are really personal. And well, that's what my tool of choice is. Someone else may and probably will prefer another type of tool. Dona will talk about the importance of rain gauges next week when we talk about watering. And you also might want to consider a soil temperature thermometer or a moisture meter. And we'll talk about both of those also later on in the presentation. Last but not least is personal protection. You need to take care of yourself. Wear a hat, have sunscreen, and definitely wear long sleeve shirts and long sleeve pants. Dona had ran into a situation with one of her colleague gardeners at her community garden where someone discovered that they had an allergy to zucchini plants because they had been scratched by the little prongs on the zucchini stems, didn't know it until they broke out. So you can just save yourself a lot of grief by being prepared. Stay hydrated, take your water bottle with you. By the time you feel thirsty, you're already starting to be dehydrated. And be really careful with your tools. Sharp tools are the most effective ones to use. They're also the ones that can do the most damage if you accidentally step on one. Keep your tools out of the garden path, lean them up against a fence. Always make sure anything with blades or prongs are pointed down. One of our master gardener colleagues paints the handles of all of her gardening tools bright red so that they're easily seen. And never ever lay your tools in a path or a walking area. Don't pick up insects if you don't know what they are. And be careful to lift heavy items properly. And this is especially important with container gardens because, as Dona said, when you fill a container garden with soil, it can get heavy. If you know you have an allergy to a pest or plant that you may run into in the garden, be prepared to deal with that. Make sure your tetanus vaccine is current. No one plans to get cut when they're in the garden, but the accidents happen. Related to that, you might want to have some antiseptic and some clean rags available in case an accident does happen. Any questions about equipment, supplies, or purchasing plants?
Yes, there was one question about your equipment slide, and someone wanted to know what the green thing with the green loop on top is.
It's a bulb planter.
Okay. That was it for the questions.
All right. Well, as Donna said at the beginning, we are both Extension Master Gardeners in Northern Virginia, and there's over 200 Extension Master Gardeners serving Arlington, Alexandria area. And our goal is to provide resources like this that promote environmentally sound gardening practices. Here are a list of some of the things we do. I want to call in particular your attention to the free virtual classes from our virtual classroom. We have the help desk where you can ask questions, as well as we're at local farmers markets. And finally, if you're in North Arlington, we have a terrific organic vegetable demonstration garden at Potomac Overlook Park. The gardeners are usually there Wednesday morning. You're welcome to come tour, and they're always willing to answer questions. There are a quick online search tip. If you're looking for something that you're not familiar with, always put site edu or site gov, site:/gov after your search, and you'll get university and government sites where you're more likely to get scientifically based information. And finally, you will be getting an electronic survey after this course, and we strongly ask that you fill that out. It gives us information to refine our classes, and it helps us to demonstrate the breadth and reach of our services. If you're a gardener living outside of Northern Virginia, here are 2 sites that you can use to find your own local cooperative extension office and to locate your own plant hardiness zones. As Donna said, these resources are also on the handout, so you can use them there. And we're really glad to have you with us today. We hope that the information we gave you in step 1 through 4 is helpful, and we hope you join us next week as we talk about steps 5 through 9 for having a healthy garden. We'll hope to see you on Friday, March 4th at 10 o'clock. Any final questions?
No, we're good, Susan, and thank you and Donna for such a wonderful, comprehensive presentation. We all learn a lot from these, and we're all looking forward to your part 2 next week. Thank you so much.